Welcome back to another episode of Relatively Damaged Live. I'm Angela.
And I am Kat.
The live shows are currently streamed Mondays to Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please remember to follow and subscribe and share with your friends. On the Monday segment of the show, Kat and I talk about topics that we find interesting. Today's topic is, how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? And Kat has the quote.
Yes, I have a quote from Henry Nouwen, and it goes as follows. Nobody escapes being wounded. We are all wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is not, how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed? But how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers.
I love that quote. I especially love that it's Disability Pride Month.
Well, yeah, which is why I thought that would be a great one for that. And you know, I know in particular you talk a lot about your disability and how that's affected you and how you've turned that into action. One of the things being the Relatively Damaged podcast, among other things. So usually you're the one who kind of interviews and asks me questions. So I'm going to turn the tables today and ask you questions.
Okay.
How did you come to that journey of not being ashamed of your disability and learn to use it as a positive force, becoming a wounded healer as such?
Ooh, that was a tough journey out of hell, I think is how I would explain it, really, because when the disability came on, all the messages that I was receiving was that I wasn't valuable anymore. And that was so painful because I wasn't just getting it from one area in my life. It was in a lot of areas, or what it felt like a lot of areas in my life at the time. And I felt really alone. So I don't think that was even the bottom of my bucket right there. That led into depression. Something with chronic pain that's normal is also like ideation and things like that. So those suicidal thoughts would pop into my mind. It was very scary and very dark. Mm-hmm. And I think that the way that I started healing was somebody came along and just loved me. They didn't talk to me necessarily. It wasn't about my disability. Did we talk about it? Yes, but that wasn't the purpose of us hanging out. I also talked with pain psychologists. I did. There was a lot, because also dealing with chronic pain. So how much of it is the pain? How much of it is my mental, what's going on mentally? And how much of it was just because I was alone or felt alone on my journey. Beyond that, not being able to fold the clothes, dropping dishes all the time, not being able to perform like what I consider a simple task, but like driving, right? Like I couldn't turn the wheel. And so I think what happened inside of my mind is I put myself down more and more and more. But when I ended up in a situation where people were loving me, just for who I was and giving me the support and love that I needed, I was able to start climbing back out. But that took, oh goodness, many years. So I would say that I finally started realizing it as a true benefit probably just even 2 years ago. I'm 11 years into this, so maybe at 9 years, I realized that, oh wait, I have some value. I'm valuable. But it took this group of people around me to show me that I had that value.
And let me ask you a question, because you mentioned just people just loving you. You mentioned professionals, pain psychologists, and things like that. Did you have contact in that journey with anybody who has gone through what you've gone through?
I ended up in what's called a functional restoration program. And so I got to be around other people that struggled with pain disorders. I think I met one other person with the same thing as I have, which is complex regional pain syndrome, or CRPS. And my concern there was the identity was only around the CRPS for that person, and that scared me. I didn't want people to only identify me as what I was struggling with. I wanted them to see my soul first, which I probably, in the grand scheme of things, at the beginning of my disability, could only identify as my CRPS. But at that point in time, I think I had started to recognize that I didn't want to stay stuck there.
So hearing that, and that's, that is something. I think that's part of that journey of healing, and then in a sense being that wounded healer, because it's not necessarily, obviously somebody who has gone through, the same thing or something very similar, there's a certain thing that you understand that people who don't experience that can't fully understand. And I know, you and I have talked about that before.
And I really, let me add
go ahead.
a caveat in real quick. I really was looking for a fix at the beginning. I would go get blessings. I would get, prayed over, and because I tried all the different kinds of medications that you could try, because there was supposed to be a quote unquote fix. And when I wasn't getting fixed to where my body worked normally, I had to reconcile that. And that was really hard. And it's really interesting that thought popped into my mind, I think, actually, because of one of the recently some missionaries came by and read a scripture that talked about being perfected in the afterlife. And the question came up to my mind, what if I'm perfect right now? Which I don't know that I would have been able to have that thought at the beginning of my disability. I don't know that I could have even accepted that maybe this is exactly how it's supposed to be right now.
And that's an interesting shift. Because, in the quote, it said going away from the shame of the woundedness. And I'm sure shame was a part of it, but it's also the acceptance of it.
Yeah, something happened quite clearly to me to shift from shame to acceptance. And there is something so important in taking pride in who I am right now instead of who I think I'm supposed to be. It's almost like when my pain comes on and there's a quote, to be in pain and think I'm not supposed to be, that is hell. And that's by Byron Katie. And I use that as a mantra. Well, to have a disability and think I'm not supposed to be too, that is also hell. So if I'm supposed to have this for whatever reason, just the perspective, right? Because a lot of this is about my joy and my happiness.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, if I'm supposed to have it, then I can find some joy and happiness in having it. If I'm not supposed to have it, then I wouldn't, and I have the belief that I wouldn't have it, then I'm fighting against what reality is. And the reality is I have it. And accepting that is actually a huge benefit, I think, from a mental health perspective. Something does change when we can take pride for things that maybe aren't perfect about, or we don't think are perfect about us.
Yeah, I mean, because the quote does talk not just about physical, but they talk about emotional or spiritual, or mental difficulties. I had an occasion to meet a woman who had recently had a stroke, and it was in a session where we were reading out of a book, and she said she would pass because it was difficult for her. And I love that acceptance of that. And we loved her anyway. It was like, okay, there was no judgment there. It was a safe environment for her to state her truth at that moment. And, realizing that everybody is in a sense a wounded healer, or can be a wounded healer, I should say, because we all come into life with wounds, or we acquire wounds as we go through life. Some are very obvious, others not so obvious. And a lot of times, we're conditioned to hide those things. I mean, I know you've talked about, your braces and people thinking you're going rollerblading.
That's actually been a fun joke. It's harder when people look at me and they're like, oh, and then I personally, it opens up a conversation for me to educate someone. But it took a long time to get to a point where it wasn't me taking it personally,
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing. And I think when you had people, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, when you had people who loved you, who saw Angela, they didn't see, oh, poor Angela.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
just saw you, the entirety of you.
Yeah.
That was reaffirming. It had to be reaffirming that it was like, yeah, I do have something. I am of value.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's also took, I just want to reiterate, it took a long time before I could own all of that.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing too, I've had to really fight to get some of the supports I need so that I can be successful,
Well, and I think that for you especially, I think that's what has spurred you, the need to have that help. I mean, there are some people who can overcome things, with the use of maybe one professional, maybe medication, like somebody who has bipolar or somebody who has ADHD can take medications and can help with that. But that's assistance on one level. It's still something you can keep hidden in a sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Your doctor may know that, but the world doesn't know that. You go out in the world and people see.
Yeah, they do, and they look, and it's so funny because the reason that people look is because it's different, right?
Right.
It's and at first I did take it like, oh my gosh, they're staring at me, they're judging me, but the reality of it is, if I look and reading about psychology and things like that, things that I really enjoy learning about and had studied previously, they're looking because it's the simple reason, because it's different, not because it's wrong, not because they don't know any, just because in their world it's different.
I'll tell a kind of a funny story as a child. I'm a bit older, and I live in Chicago. It's been a very segregated city in parts. And when I was small, the only show on television that they had a Black or African American character was Bill Cosby and I Spy. And I was about 3 years old, and my mom took me downtown. And that was the only difference that I had known. And there happened to be a Black man in the elevator with us. We were going to visit my grandma who worked downtown. And I'm like, look, Mommy, I spy. Because that was the only difference. And that's natural. I just say to point that out. It's natural. We recognize a difference and we point it out. Now, there was no judgment as a 3-year-old child on my part, but I did recognize the difference.
Right. And I want to just point to that too. There was no judgment on your part, just a recognition of the difference. So I think that on some level, then it falls back on me as a person with a disability that does look different because of my braces to have that conversation, because the people who look because it's different probably are looking, they just don't understand. They don't know what it is. And this, I might be their first or maybe a limited experience that they're having of someone with a disability. And so as a, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, as an advocate, there's another word, but regardless, I can show them that we're not scary people. And we're not all angry. Yes, have I gotten angry as a person with a disability because I didn't get what I need? Absolutely. But do I need to take that out on the curious person who just notices something different? No.
And I mean, that's a good point is that education, I think, is the key, because we're so conditioned to think in a certain way, that things like physical disability, mental health issues are, people are made to feel ashamed of that. There's a certain shame, and the more people that talk about it, yes, I struggled with that. Yes, I had difficulty with that. It brings that awareness, and in bringing that awareness, I think it gives empathy, but it also allows people to heal. I think of working, having been a librarian. Granted, I was at the university level, but I did do some projects with people in literacy. And I had several opportunities to work with people who had difficulty reading. And mainly it was dyslexia, considered a disability. And all that requires is new ways of learning, new ways of thinking about it, being able to read and recognizing that that's what it is. Look at Joe Biden. Again, not politics, but what he had to overcome with his stuttering. And he still has that issue. And, it's not not to make it a stigma, but to make it, oh, okay, yes, this is something that's an issue. Okay, have compassion, have empathy. What can I do to help you?
Well, yeah, and for him, wanting to participate or do speeches in politics, that would for him be really important. I would, what if we couldn't change it, right? Would it still be, because I think there's this scary part of, maybe not scary, but this idea that we need to overcome that struggle, or we need to fix that problem. And is stuttering terribly wrong? No. It just, I stutter, for crying out loud.
and I mean, people have been stigmatized. Oh, you're stupid because you can't get the words out. And it's not that at all. It is a physical disability that requires, patience and practice to be able to speak.
Yeah.
And there are occasions, just as you know, with your pain, there are things that will cause it to flare up. Somebody who stutters may have, a problem if they're nervous, or they're placed into a situation where they have to think faster than they can speak. They may have to speak slower in order to get their point across clearly.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just guessing because I don't know that much about that particular disability.
Yeah.
But so education of people who are not disabled is a big thing for you. But how do you find that doing your podcast and speaking with others and your advocacy work in your community? How did you make that leap from I am okay, I am all right, to saying I need to help not only myself but help others?
I think it came down to the realization that I had a voice. So I couldn't go physically do, but I did have a voice and I could use that. And it was kind of, it took somebody doing something that made me really angry. The caregiving company had said we will only do the 5 things on the CMS guideline, which essentially said we're going to treat you like an animal and we're not going to help you be successful in your life. Your hands don't work, that's too bad, find somebody else, but we'll help you with X, Y, and Z. And it was just really, I figured I was going to have to hire a handyman, a cleaner, like there was a whole we came up with a list of all the different people, and mind you, I'm on limited income, so it was I was like, this is wrong. And I couldn't take my kids to school or to doctor's appointments. They were really upset, or the company said no. And I said, this is wrong. I mean, I'm legally obligated to do these things in the state of California where I live. As a parent, there are certain things that you have to do. And if you don't, then your kids can get taken away. So as I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, so I've got this person waiting for me to need them in these other areas, but we can't do this or this. It didn't make any sense to me. And I thought, no, that's right. So I actually changed caregiving companies and really decided that this is a big problem. I could have lost my kids over that had they been younger.
Yeah.
Then there's a whole, sorry, this is just a whole nother thing. There are people with disabilities who want to have kids, and it was funny, people, and sometimes it's like someone will acquire a disability and then they'll be like, well, you should have thought about that before you had kids. Well, how in the world was I supposed to know I was going to get a disability?
Right.
If somebody with a disability wanting to have kids, why can't they? What would be the reason for them not to? What if they can love? That is something kids need.
Exactly. I mean, I agree with you, because there is more to a person than just tending to their physical needs. Okay, I can make a meal for you. I can do this. Unfortunately, one of my neighbor passed away. She's a woman who was in a wheelchair. She had polio. And towards the end of her life, even more so, she needed care. And it was the same kind of thing. This is all that we can do.
Yeah.
And it didn't meet any of her, emotional or social needs or anything like that. And so
no, it's like, darn it, they forget about the human. They even tell caregivers not to connect with the person they're caring for. And it is actually smarter to say, you will connect. Here are some tools on how you're going to cope with that. Let me give you tools, because the connection happens regardless. The best caregivers connect.
And that makes sense. I mean, I'm thinking about, myself and caregivers for me.
Mm-hmm.
Caregiver, my wife got bit by the dogs. They were in a fight. And what was so touching with the caregivers is that even though we had to go to the emergency room and it was a wait, when we saw the doctor, I mean, she took the time. She was very congenial. And then several days later, she called. What emergency room physician does that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who's working overnight and then calls a few days later to see how you're doing? It just shows there's a connection. I mean, it's not a connection like necessarily with your caregivers, but it was even that moment, the caregiving, that it
Mm-hmm.
was just like, hey, yes, I acknowledge that I fixed your hand up. I want to see how you're doing.
Well, too, there's that study on rabbits. I wish I could recall it, but they had these rabbits and they were doing a study, and there were some rabbits that did well. And they couldn't figure out, they treated all of the rabbits the same as far as like what they were doing in the study. The only difference was a person. And that person who cared for those particular rabbits loved them. And because she loved them, they did better than all of the other rabbits in the experiment. And I wish I could remember the experiment, what it was called. That's what love does. Love does something special that transcends time and space, that it, I wish everyone could have it, at least, even. But at the same time, I want to reiterate, love is forgiving and not forgetting. It's to be given and not to be gotten. Because as soon as I start expecting, well, this is what love looks like, and this is what someone should give me, and and I go down that line, then that's not. I can't claim that as love. But if I can give love, then I'm going to do a lot better. And then the people around me tend to give it more too. And then we tend to connect on that deeper level.
And I love that, because that's really where you started. That's where the healing started for you, was with love.
Mm-hmm.
And here that's what you're saying too. And so in the things that you're doing, yes, there was an anger, but there also was a love there too. Love for yourself. Yeah. And expanded that, because in your advocacy, it's pointing out this need that people aren't seeing.
Mm-hmm.
It's
more than that. It's more.
Yeah.
It's that deeper level. And I think for me, that's why with the podcast and the different stories that I get to ask people about, is this underlying showing that we are so much more similar than we are different. And it's in the similarities where we can support each other. Those differences are really important. You being different from me and having this conversation, and how we come on these lives, those different perspectives are super important. The more important part, though, for me to care about our relationship or my relationships with others, is that we have this underlying humanity. And I'm okay when we disagree, because I know that I care about you and you care about me. Mm-hmm. And it just happens to be that we disagree on a topic. No big deal.
Well, that's it exactly. When we come on here, I mean, I think for us, this is a labor of love, coming on here, exploring different ideas, and different things that are going on, and trying to come to an understanding of that. But I feel as if, and I certainly try, sometimes I've come on angry about topics, but I've always tried to come back to that love. Why am I angry? Sometimes we're angry because of love.
Yeah, I would not have started my journey had I not been angry about the current situation of the rules or the guidelines that have been put out there, and how some companies use them as maximums instead of minimums. and had an underlying love for my children, and how devastated when I realized that there are some people in these situations that would lose their children or have lost their children because they couldn't do the basics. That was where I was like, oh no, this has been one of the best journeys of my life. I've learned who I am. I love my children. How could I ask anyone to put any parent in this situation, whether or not they started with a disability or acquired a disability later? How could I let them think that their children are going to be taken away? To me, that's unacceptable. There's got to be a better way.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. I just know there's got to be a better way.
Mm-hmm. And especially if someone's coming over to your house to make a sandwich for you to have lunch, they can certainly make one for your children. But what a stranger may not be able to give is that true maternal love that you have, that deep love that you have for your children. Nobody else can give that to them.
No. And I think probably that's where the question comes in. Some people probably, and at the hardest parts of my disability, it was my job to be the parent. And I was still very clear about that. You know, if the children needed something, I needed to be asked first. And it needed to be a team effort almost. You know, the caregiver couldn't just do it. I needed to participate on some level because I am the parent. And I think probably the big concern is that people with disabilities will just hand that over. Well, no, this is a precious job, and it's not something I'm going to hand over to somebody just because. Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
and that helps me to understand, and hopefully anybody who's listening today, that you know how important that is, how important that was to you, and how coming forward and having that voice, realizing what you can contribute. You might not be able to drive your kids, but you sure as hell can advocate for them and love them better than anyone else can.
Yeah.
So
and have those important conversations. But yes, I know we're over
we're
time.
past time. You usually keep track, but I guess we reverse roles a little bit today. So
we did. It's kind of funny. Okay. Well, I'm Angela.
And I'm Kat.
And you can always check out the Relatively Damaged podcast, where I interview guests who have overcome some sort of struggle in their lives. And you can find the podcast on Spotify, Apple, and many more. I'm also going to be releasing a book here in September called Poems from a Lost Soul. So start looking for that.